In the midst of an important diplomatic meeting in Moscow, marked by tension between African and Russian interests, Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, surprises everyone by interrupting Vladimir Putin with an unexpected statement. In front of world leaders and the international press, Traoré addresses sensitive topics such as African sovereignty, the exploitation of natural resources, and the need for a new global order. The gesture completely changes the course of the conversation, impacting not only bilateral agreements but also the global perception of Africa's role in the contemporary political scene. The story unfolds in 10 interconnected chapters, exploring the behind-the-scenes of international politics, the pressures on Traoré, the Kremlin's reactions, and the effects of this intervention on relations between Africa and Russia. The narrative is set mainly in Moscow, with vivid descriptions of the city under the harsh winter cold, from the luxurious halls of the Kremlin to the discreet cafes where diplomats meet out of the spotlight. In this intense and realistic drama, the protagonists face political and personal challenges, while the line between diplomacy and confrontation becomes increasingly blurred. The heavy wooden doors of the Kremlin's Catherine Hall creaked open, sending a low echo through the opulent space. Crystal chandeliers shimmered under the dim winter light, filtering through the tall, arched windows. Outside, Moscow was buried under a thick layer of snow, muffling the usual city noise into an eerie silence. Ibrahim Traoré adjusted his charcoal-gray overcoat as he stepped inside, flanked by 2 senior diplomats from Burkina Faso. His expression was composed, but his mind raced. This wasn't just another diplomatic meeting. It was a confrontation with one of the most powerful men in the world. Across the hall, Vladimir Putin stood near the fireplace, speaking quietly with Sergei Lavrov and other key members of the Russian administration. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes tracked every movement in the room with clinical precision. The air was thick with anticipation. Cameras had been left outside. This was meant to be a private discussion, but everyone present knew that what transpired here could shape alliances and shift global power balances. A Kremlin aide approached Traoré, offering him a seat at the long mahogany table. He nodded politely, but didn't sit. Instead, he looked around, taking in the ornate golden moldings, the imperial red tapestries, and the portraits of Russian leaders staring down from the walls. The weight of history was palpable. The meeting began formally, as expected. Lavrov welcomed the delegation, followed by a series of prepared remarks about strengthening economic cooperation and deepening security ties. Putin remained silent at first, listening intently. Traoré listened too, but his mind was elsewhere, on the silent crisis unfolding in West Africa, on the pressures from former colonial powers, and on the whispered warnings from his own advisers not to provoke Moscow. Yet, as the conversation turned towards military cooperation and the extension of Russian private security contractors in Burkina Faso, Traoré felt a shift inside him, a conviction, a line he could not allow to be crossed. He raised his hand slightly. The room went quiet. Even the faint hum of the heating system seemed to pause. Putin turned his icy gaze directly at him. "Yes, President Traoré?" he said, in smooth, formal Russian, which was immediately translated. Traoré took a breath, his voice calm but resolute. "Before we proceed," he said in French, letting the interpreter catch up, "I need to make something very clear." The diplomats exchanged glances. Lavrov leaned forward, his fingers steepled. Traoré continued, "Africa is no longer a continent to be carved up by foreign interests. Our resources, our security, and our future. These are matters that we will decide, not those seeking to extend spheres of influence." For a moment, No one moved. Putin arched an eyebrow, as if mildly intrigued, but his expression otherwise remained unreadable. The course of the conversation had just changed completely, and everyone in that room knew this was not going to be just another meeting. The silence that followed Ibrahim Traoré's declaration seemed to stretch endlessly, broken only by the faint crackle of the fireplace. Every pair of eyes in the grand hall was now fixed on him, assessing his tone, his intent, and, above all, the consequences of his words. Putin remained still, his fingertips pressed together, elbows resting on the armrests of his chair. He was a man well versed in the theater of diplomacy, accustomed to unexpected turns. But this wasn't posturing. It was defiance, carefully measured, yet undeniably real. A junior Russian diplomat scribbled frantically in a leather-bound notebook. Lavrov, seasoned and impassive, adjusted his glasses and broke the silence. "President Traoré," he began, his voice polite but edged with steel, "Russia seeks only to assist Burkina Faso in stabilizing its security situation. We respect your sovereignty." Traoré met his gaze calmly. "Respect is shown through action, not contracts," he replied. The translator hesitated a beat, realizing the subtle power behind the phrase, before rendering it in Russian. Putin finally leaned forward, placing his forearms on the table. His voice, when it came, was low and measured. "Are you implying, Mr. President, that Russia's presence in Africa is unwelcome?" Traoré didn't flinch. "I am saying that Africa must not become the battleground of great powers any longer." A sharp intake of breath came from one of the Russian aides. The tension in the room thickened. Traoré continued, his voice steady. "Our people seek dignity, not dependency. Partnership, not patronage." For a split second, Putin allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to crease the corner of his mouth. Whether out of amusement or respect, it was impossible to tell. He leaned back again, fingers drumming lightly on the table. "You are a bold man, President Traoré," he said, his tone devoid of hostility but laden with implication. "Boldness is often necessary, but also dangerous." Outside, snowflakes began to fall more heavily, swirling through the gray Moscow sky. Inside the hall, the mood was as cold as the winter beyond the thick Kremlin walls. Traoré didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked out the window at the snow-covered spires of St. Basil's Cathedral in the distance. A continent away, his people awaited the decisions he would make here. "I am aware of the risks," he finally said. Putin gave a slight nod, as though acknowledging a worthy opponent. Then he gestured for tea to be brought in, signaling that the meeting, though forever altered, would continue. But everyone in the room understood. The balance of power had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. The conversation would never be the same. The ornate double doors of the Catherine Hall closed softly behind them as the official session was adjourned for a brief recess. The aides dispersed discreetly, some heading to adjacent rooms to coordinate press statements, others retreating to quiet corners to draft notes for their superiors. But Ibrahim Traoré remained standing near the window, his eyes still fixed on the whitewashed skyline of Moscow. From this height, the Kremlin's towers and the frozen Moskva River looked peaceful, deceptively so. He knew that beneath this veneer, geopolitical currents were in violent motion. His chief advisor, Amadou, approached quietly, speaking in a low voice in their native Mure language. "You made your point, perhaps too clearly." Traoré allowed a faint smile to cross his lips, but didn't turn away from the window. "There are moments when clarity is more important than diplomacy." Amadou exhaled slowly. "Moscow is not Paris. They will not forget what you said. I don't intend them to. Behind them, a Kremlin protocol officer politely informed Traoré that President Putin would receive him privately in the green drawing room after the break. A one-on-one meeting. No aides, no translators beyond the official Kremlin staff. Traoré nodded, signaling he understood, though inside his thoughts quickened. This was the moment he had anticipated and prepared for. Minutes later, he was led through a maze of gilded corridors, the air heavy with history and power. The walls bore portraits of czars and Soviet leaders, their painted eyes following him as he walked. In the green drawing room, Putin was already seated near a small table, beneath an oil painting of Catherine the Great. A samovar steamed quietly nearby, filling the room with the faint aroma of black tea. "Please," Putin gestured to the chair opposite him, his voice polite but neutral. Traoré sat, his posture relaxed but alert. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of a gilded clock on the mantelpiece. Then Putin broke the silence. "Your intervention surprised many in the hall." "That was not my intention," Traoré replied evenly, "but I had to be honest." Putin nodded slowly, his pale blue eyes studying the man in front of him. "Honesty is rare in these rooms." Traoré held his gaze. "It's time it becomes common." Putin allowed himself a brief chuckle, then leaned back in his chair. "You remind me of someone." "Who?" Putin shook his head lightly, as if dismissing the thought. "It doesn't matter." He poured tea for both of them, his movements precise and practiced. As Traoré accepted the delicate porcelain cup, he realized that this private exchange, stripped of public performance and ceremonial language, would be the true negotiation, the real test of will and vision. He took a sip of the hot, bitter tea, his eyes never leaving Putin's. The Russian president broke the silence once more. "So, tell me, President Traoré, what exactly do you want from Russia?" And at that moment, Traoré knew the conversation had shifted from confrontation to something more dangerous: negotiation. For a brief moment, Ibrahim Traoré didn't answer. He let Putin's question linger in the air, weighing its true meaning. "What exactly do you want from Russia?" It was more than an invitation. It was a test, a provocation designed to reveal weakness, desire, or contradiction. Traoré placed his cup of tea carefully on the saucer and leaned slightly forward, his hands resting on his knees, his voice steady. "What I want," he began, "is for Russia to understand that Africa is not seeking new masters. We welcome partners, but we will not trade one form of dependence for another." Putin tilted his head slightly, the faintest trace of amusement flickering across his expression. "You speak as if Africa can afford to dictate terms." Traoré didn't react to the provocation. "We cannot afford not to." Putin smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. He tapped his fingers lightly on the armrest. "You are young, Mr. President. Idealism suits you, but the world is more complicated." Traoré matched his gaze. "The world is complicated because men in rooms like this have chosen to make it so." Putin's smile faded. For the first time, there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, perhaps curiosity, perhaps something more cautious. "You understand the risks," Putin said, almost softly. "You stand here, in the heart of Russia, making statements that many would consider dangerous." "I understand the risks," Traoré repeated, "but I also understand my people's desperation and their hope. We will not be pawns." Putin leaned back again, studying him. "You are not like the others," he said finally, almost as if speaking to himself. Traoré said nothing. He knew this was not the moment to press further. Silence, at times, was a form of strength. After a long pause, Putin placed his cup on the table and looked directly at Traoré. "Very well," he said. "Let's stop with the abstractions. Burkina Faso needs security assistance. Your country is under pressure from insurgent groups, from economic instability, from outside interference." Traoré nodded, acknowledging the reality. "And Russia," Putin continued, "can provide that assistance, quickly, effectively." "But at what cost?" Traoré asked quietly. Putin didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood and walked toward the tall window, looking out at the snow falling over the Kremlin's inner courtyard. Without turning, he said, "The cost is always influence. That's the currency of power." Traoré remained seated, his mind racing. This was the real heart of the negotiation. Not weapons, not contracts, but influence, autonomy, and the future shape of his country's sovereignty. He stood slowly, joining Putin at the window. "I am not here to bargain away my country's soul," Traoré said, his voice low but firm. Putin turned to face him, his expression inscrutable. "Then we will see," he said, "if your convictions can withstand what comes next." Outside, the snow continued to fall silently, covering Moscow in white, while inside, the air between them thickened with the weight of choices yet to be made. The meeting concluded without formal agreements. No document signed, no ceremonial handshakes for the cameras. Just two men, locked in a silent acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted between them. As Ibrahim Traoré exited the green drawing room, escorted by Kremlin aides down the long marbled corridors, his thoughts were far from the gilded ceilings and imperial portraits. He could feel the undercurrents already. Pressures, consequences, eyes watching from every corner of the world. His chief advisor, Amadou, was waiting by the official car in the Kremlin courtyard, his breath forming thick clouds in the freezing air. "Well?" Amadou asked quietly, as Traoré climbed in. Traoré exhaled deeply before responding. "We held the line." Amadou nodded, but looked unconvinced. "And now?" Traoré glanced at the dark silhouettes of armed guards stationed along the Kremlin walls. "Now, we see who—"
Burkina President confronts Putin in Moscow. No deal signed. Traoré challenges Russian presence in Africa. He stood by the suite window, watching Moscow's city lights blink through the mist of snowfall as Amadou read updates from his secure tablet. "They're spinning it," Amadou said, scrolling through diplomatic cables and news briefs. "The French are pleased. The Americans too." Traoré remained silent, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon. He knew that for some, his defiance of Russia was symbolic, a reclaiming of African agency. But for others, it was a dangerous provocation. His phone buzzed on the desk behind him, an encrypted message. "We need to talk. Tonight." The sender, a senior EU diplomat stationed in Moscow, known for discreet channels and unofficial conversations. Amadou saw the notification and raised an eyebrow. "More negotiations?" Traoré shook his head. "More consequences." The hotel suite suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in with the invisible pressure of global politics. He turned back to Amadou. "Prepare the team. We're not done here." Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing Moscow in cold indifference, while the world beyond was just beginning to feel the heat of what had been set in motion behind those Kremlin doors. Later that night, under the cover of darkness and a persistent snowfall, Ibrahim Traoré slipped quietly out of his hotel through a side entrance, accompanied only by Amadou and a single security officer. Moscow at night was a different city, quieter, colder, its grandeur muted by layers of ice and snow. The black sedan waiting at the curb belonged to the European diplomatic delegation, its license plates discreetly obscured. As they drove through the empty boulevards, Traoré stared out at the frost-covered statues of Soviet heroes, now silent witnesses to yet another chapter of history unfolding in their midst. The car pulled up to an inconspicuous building in the Arbat district, a historic neighborhood known more for its art galleries and old cafes than for diplomacy. Inside, in a dimly lit conference room above a closed bookstore, the EU diplomat awaited them. A tall, silver-haired man in his early 60s, he rose as Traoré entered, extending a hand. "Mr. President," he greeted in fluent French, "thank you for coming." Traoré shook his hand firmly, but offered no smile. The diplomat gestured to the seat across from him, then poured 2 glasses of Armenian cognac. "No press, no translators," he said. "Just us." Traoré sat, nodding for Amadou to remain standing by the door. "I assume you've heard?" Traoré said, cutting through the formalities. "Of course," the diplomat replied, leaning back. "The whole of Brussels is awake. Paris, too. You've made quite an impression." Traoré took the glass but didn't drink. "And?" The diplomat smiled faintly. "And they're wondering what your next move is. More importantly, how we can help." Traoré set the glass down, his eyes narrowing. "Help or control?" The diplomat chuckled softly, acknowledging the point. "Let's call it mutual interest." Traoré leaned forward, his voice low but resolute. "Africa's interest is sovereignty. We are done being the proving ground for other nations' ambitions." The diplomat nodded, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "A noble position, Mr. President, but the question remains, how long can you hold it?" Traoré didn't answer immediately. The weight of the question settled between them like the thick fog outside. Then he said, quietly but firmly, "As long as it takes." The diplomat studied him for a long moment, then pulled out a small envelope from his inner jacket pocket, sliding it across the table. "Contacts, channels, should you decide Moscow is no longer viable." Traoré looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. "I'll consider it," he said, standing. The diplomat smiled again, rising as well. "You've started something, Mr. President. I hope you're ready for what comes next." Traoré paused at the door, glancing back over his shoulder. "I've been ready my whole life." Outside, the snow had stopped falling, but the cold remained, sharp and unforgiving. As they drove back through the sleeping city, Amadou finally broke the silence. "They're all circling now." Traoré nodded. "Let them." Because now he realized the game was no longer about Moscow alone. It was about the entire world watching and waiting to see if an African leader could truly stand independent in a system designed to make that impossible. As the presidential plane lifted off from Moscow's Sheremetyevo airport, slicing through the gray dawn sky, Ibrahim Traoré sat by the window, silently watching the Russian landscape recede beneath the clouds. Next to him, Amadou reviewed briefing notes for the meetings awaiting them in Ouagadougou. The international media was already in overdrive. Headlines dissecting every word, every gesture from the meeting with Putin. Analysts speculating on Burkina Faso's future alliances. Traoré closed his eyes briefly, shutting out the noise of the world. For a moment, there was only silence, the kind that comes after a decision has been made, but before its consequences fully unfold. He thought about the conversations in the Kremlin, about the offer quietly placed on the table by the European diplomat, and about the thousands of Burkina-based citizens who placed their faith in him to lead their country through these treacherous waters. This wasn't victory. Not yet. It was something more dangerous and more difficult: independence. As the plane banked westward toward the African continent, the rising sun cast a faint orange glow on the horizon. A new day was beginning. Traoré opened his eyes, straightened his posture, and reached for the report Amadou handed him. There was still so much work to do, and he was ready.